Thank you very much. Kia ora. Hello from, yes, Auckland, New Zealand. I'd like to take the opportunity, first of all, just to thank you for the chance to present and congratulate the organisers on the virtual system as well as in situ. I wish I was there with you in Darwin. I'm going to talk about perhaps some initial findings from research on that I'm conducting with Māori perspectives of success of ecological restoration, and that the basis of this is, of course, ecological restoration in general is the success has been debated for probably about 2 decades and what constitutes a success. And I think, and Dane McDonald's talk this morning, she sort of mentioned all the guidelines, and part of the reason for those has always been to try and give some consistency to how we measure success. So what I'm particularly interested in is how different groups measure success of ecological restoration. I've started off with part of my research has been looking at community groups and agencies. In New Zealand, vast majority of the community groups that are engaged in restoration are on government land and therefore have to have a relationship with agencies. This work was just published last month, and that's a reference at the bottom. So I'm working in the top half of the North Island, covering the little dots there represent all the restoration projects that responded to my questionnaires, and really we're asking people what do they consider to be success, and how do you know, what are the attributes and how do you know? And of interest is of the over 100 people that responded, I think 98% of them considered their projects to be successful. So you can sort of see the need to have some standardized measure here. So rather than not going through all that data, just two graphs, but looking at the attributes that my respondents said were measures of success. You can see that right at the top, everyone obviously are into the ecology. We're doing a lot for the indigenous biodiversity, a lot for removing the stresses, in particular the exotic species. If I look at agencies, they picked up a lot more of the perhaps more complex ecological attributes, sorry, that jump back. And then, of course, the really complex ecology, the community groups dropped out of. They either don't know, don't understand, or it's just not on their radar. However, community groups picked up a whole lot of attributes that agencies didn't, and they seem to have perhaps a lot more social measures that they would pick up as success. So with interviews with some of these practitioners, they all sort of came up with reasons why they were different. And I'll just pick out some of the key things that they've said. Community group people do seem to think they have a big picture of what's happening in the ecology. The agencies sort of suggest that they would, but they're not allowed to, or there's no money, they have to stick to their patch. A lot of community group people thought agencies worked in silos. But the message there is everyone seems to think they've got a holistic approach to the restoration. However, when you look at what they're actually measuring, last graph, you look at those top 3, that's not holistic. there really is, and this applies to agencies as well, they really are species focused. The monitoring of invasive species, translocation of bird species perhaps. Look, the birds are very obvious in New Zealand, in the New Zealand forests, and vegetation less so, but easy to monitor because it doesn't run around. Community groups really are focused on monitoring invasive species. And one of the main jobs in New Zealand is the removal of rats, mice, mustelids, cats, and, sorry folks, but the brush-tailed possum. So that is certainly not holistic. And we acknowledge that of these respondents, 89% are New Zealand European. And so the research project has moved on to think about our iwi, which are our Maori people. You know, these iwi-based projects, what are their views? And that's really what I want to talk about now. So the question is, what is the role of Mātauranga Māori, which is their worldview, the cultural practices with respect to ecological restoration? And my methodology is essentially just talking to Māori, and the questions there were to initiate a discussion, but they weren't necessarily, the discussion wasn't necessarily structured around the questions. So I think I should just pause and a disclaimer here. I'm not Māori. I'm an ecologist, and I was very taken with one of the Māori speakers yesterday who referred to the scientists as being a one-day mushroom. I aspire not to be a one-day mushroom. There's a big change in New Zealand with a lot of these, with the Mātauranga Māori being recognised and accepted as valued parts of the process of restoration. And what is quite interesting with these questions, sometimes the question was an answer, but the discussions really had one or two answers that covered everything. And what I'm going to go through now is those perhaps three key elements that came out of these discussions. And those of you familiar with traditional ecological knowledge or traditional knowledge, these won't be a surprise to you. And of course, they've been mentioned in the previous two talks. So the first one is mauri. Mauri is a life principle, a life force, a vital essence of that everything has, and it's everywhere. Everything is connected through this life force. And to the New Zealand Māori often concentrate the mauri of a forest or a community into an object such as this Māori stone here, and it's deposited in a sacred location. So it's sort of it's the energy of everything. And one of the interviewees made the comment that Maori can't be restored. It's already there, but we can enhance it. And I thought I'd take you through that with a reference to an ecological restoration project, Turitirumātangi Island in Auckland, New Zealand. Some of you may have visited it if you're particularly a bird people. This is a 1984 photograph. Highly degraded island and farmed for over 100 years. And in a degraded site, well, the ecological components are there. You've got species, you've got links between all the species, you've got this ecological structure of food webs and food pyramids, and of course you've got all these nutrients recycling. And then we come along as restorationists and we replant the island. This island's had 280,000 trees planted over the course of 10 years, and there's a couple of before and after photos of the same site. But the point here is that both photos, the ecology is there. We've got species, community components. You've got relationships between them. You've got the trophic structures, you've got the recycling of nutrients, but one from a natural or indigenous biodiversity perspective, one is poor and the other is better. The island is well known, as I hinted at, for the birds. The birds populations have flourished, and others have been brought to the island as its role as a sanctuary. It is predator-free or rat-free now. So we've raised the ecological integrity, certainly in terms of species present. The seabirds are recolonising the islands. We've got nutrients occurring here. And so I would suggest that we've enhanced the Māori, the life force of this island. And the interviewee referred to this term, Manaaki Māori, which means looking after, caring for the Māori, and suggested that this was not an equivalent term for ecological restoration, but it certainly included ecological restoration. The second point is whakapapa and stories. Everything has Māori, Māori's everything, and everything's connected. We've made that point. But whakapapa, which is the genealogy of everything, or the lineages, how they're related, shows the connectedness of the Māori. And it's often expressed through stories of legend or pūrako. One other interviewee made a very strong point that the restoration should follow the appropriate order, and the whakapapa determines the order of any activity. And I explained this through, she explained this through an example. The whakapapa of winds determines prevailing winds, which in turn determines which forest species should be planted. And then the second story was the story of Remuapa and Pingao. So a very common activity in New Zealand, as I guess elsewhere in the world, is the gathering of seafood. And to Māori, kaimoana, the seafood, is a very valued resource. But of course, a lot of places they're depleted, they're under pressure. And so we might want that these are the common seafoods, tuangi and pipi. We might want to restore those. But to do a complete restoration, you have to understand the whakapapa. They're related to two other organisms. They're related to pingao, which is a sand sedge, and Remuapa, which is the bull kelp, which is, I think, throughout the southern hemisphere. And to do a restoration, you can't just work on the seafood, you need to work on the land and the sea as well. So that's the connectiveness, and it's looking at the big picture. And of course, that does happen. And if I come to this a regional park near Auckland, the restoration there is doing two things. There is a marine protected area offshore, and there is dune protection through planting of pingao. So we've got these two elements there, and you would expect from an ecological perspective for the bits in the middle to be responding with that connection. So the connectivity is there. Now the rationale for doing these restoration isn't because of the, I understand, it wasn't because of the whakapapa or the big picture, but it certainly shows that it could have been because of that whakapapa or an understanding. And the third element are people. This is a very, very commonly used saying or whakatauki in New Zealand. E haha te mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It is the people, the people, the people. And whilst people are often the problem with degradation, usually the problem of environmental degradation, they are, of course, also the solution. And so all interviewees identified that their people, their tribal groups, iwi or hapu, can get benefits from ecological restoration. And a key one is restoring people back to their traditional lands and resources. They can access their traditional resources, whether that be food or healing medicinal plants. The community welfare will be improved through that, particularly mental health. And increasingly, the restoration will, through being involved, they can generate the capacity for their own environmental management. And so these are some of the comments that they made. And the taonga are just gifts or special things. And one interviewee was referring to this. The Māori have a collectivism sort of approach. It's for everyone doing something for each other, for their tribes. Of course, the community, going back to community group respondents, there's certainly identified, as I mentioned, that social elements are there. But as one Māori person saw their social side as being individualistic. And I think, again, in literature, this comes out, people getting involved to get some personal gain. Often that's about knowledge, about skills, whereas the Māori approach is for everybody. So those three things, I think, are, as I said, are probably very common in traditional or indigenous cultures. And I would suggest that, you know, this is a truly holistic approach to ecological restoration, and very different to the approach by non-Māori practitioners. So I just want to finish with an acknowledgement to the survey petitioners. They've shared their time and knowledge. So, nō reira, he mihi nui kia koutou tēnei rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.